organization. I forget what it was. I don't know if it was the Masonic Lodge. I have no idea. I just remember he told me he was trying to join this club or this organization, and each member had a vote. And so when they cast their votes, one member, he didn't know who, slipped in a black ball. I guess if you were voted in, if it was yes, you put in a white ball. But if you voted no, he got blackballed. And when he got the black ball, that meant that he was rejected from the organization. And I remember he telling me how hurt he was by being rejected by this organization because of one blackball vote. We live in a world where we get to make judgments about others. We get to cast our vote and express our opinions on a regular basis about other people. We can choose who our friends are. We can choose who we don't want to hang out with and associate with. We vote for politicians. We get to choose whether to accept or reject them. We can vote with our feet if we don't like or agree with something going on in an organization or even in a church. We can just say, okay, I vote by leaving. But in this particular parable, Jesus shares with us a very good lesson here on how do we know or who decides who's in or out of the faith or out of the church. This particular parable radically changed my practice of ministry and attitude towards, I guess you'd call unbelievers, many years ago. My past background as a Christian was shaped by what I would consider and call Christian fundamentalism. I was saved in an independent, fundamentalist Baptist church. Now, I'm not knocking Baptists at all. Matter of fact, I've been accused of being a Baptist countless times. People say, are you sure you're a Methodist? Yeah, I'm sure. But you sound like a Baptist to me. But I was saved in a very strict fundamentalist Baptist church. I mean, that was back in the days when you did not listen to rock and roll music. I mean, what you guys play just now, you don't do it in the church. But boys had to have short hair. Girls had to wear dresses, not pants. I mean, that's the kind of church we were in. And if you didn't subscribe to the party line, then you were not a member of good standing. There was a very clear line between us and them. We had a pretty good idea of who was a Christian and who was not. At least we thought we did. We were pretty good at judging others. How did we know who was in? How did we know who was out? Well, much of our criteria for deciding who was a Christian and who was not a Christian was based on a series of do's and don'ts. If you did these things, we could pretty well discern you were a Christian. But if you didn't do these things, you did a lot of don'ts, then it was obvious you needed to be saved. Real Christians did not do certain things. And we thought we'd figured out what they did and did not do. Now that's pretty much my past. Now this parable helped me understand, though, who gets to decide who is a Christian and who isn't. And you know one thing I discovered from this parable that was eye-awakening for me, is one of those aha moments as I studied this years ago. I discovered that who gets to decide who's in and who's out is not me. And guess what? It's not you either. Jesus shows us how to answer the question, who decides who is a Christian and who isn't, by telling us this story. And in this story, it's about a farmer who plants a field with what he calls good seed. Now, the good seed is healthy, pure, unmixed with any other kind of seed. So it's just pure seed. It's not mixed with any other type of foreign seed, whatever it is he bought at the store or wherever he was at the feed place or the seed place. He paid premium price for good quality seed. And so the farmer plants this good quality seed in the ground, and it says he went to bed. After a hard day's work, he didn't have any tractor or plow. He basically just had to go and dig his holes and plant his seed. It was tough work, so after the day was over, he went to bed. And it says, Jesus tells us that night, an enemy who wished the farmer harm came and vandalized his field by planting weeds, sowing weeds in the field, in the newly planted seed. Now, as the crops began to grow, Jesus says, some of the farmhands noticed something bad was happening in the field. As they walked through the field and they saw the plants coming up, they noticed that there was a bunch of weeds apparently growing in this field alongside the good wheat. So they go and report their discovery to the farmer. And they ask him, say, didn't you plant the premium seed? Didn't you buy the good stuff? Yeah, the farmer said. But somebody apparently has vandalized the field. So the helpers, the employees, the farm hands, asked the farmer, do you want us to go and start removing the weeds from the field right now? There was a good reason for that. The weeds in this story were a big problem to ancient farmers. These weeds that we're talking about here, if I've read about this stuff, why it was such a nuisance to ancient farmers. The weeds were called bearded darnel. You say, well, what's the deal? Well, they look like wheat. It really was hard. Matter of fact, if I had pictures of them, you could see that the real wheat looks one way, and the bearded darnel looks darn near exactly the same. But you wanted to get rid of them because even though they look like good wheat, they were poisonous. And if you ate that bearded darnel weed if you thought it was wheat and you ate it, then it would cause dizziness and intestinal problems if digested, if you know what I mean. And they tasted terrible. This particular weed could literally ruin a crop if it was harvested with the good wheat. So, to the surprise of the workers, the farmer chose not to get rid of the weeds in the field at this time. And his reason was, he says, according to Jesus, that if you pull out the bad weeds, now it would result in losing some of the good stuff that was growing in the field. Jesus says, the farmer says, well, the roots would intermingle with the good wheat, and if we pull out the weeds, then we'll be pulling out some of the good along with it. So the farmer's decision, according to Jesus, was just let them grow together until harvest time. And he says, at harvest time we'll bring in the professionals. We'll bring in the people who are experts at judging between a wheat and a weed. And we'll let them do the harvesting. So later, after Jesus' sermon was over, after the story had concluded and the crowds had went home, and he was alone with his disciples, they asked Jesus to explain the lesson in more detail. And basically what they're asking Jesus in this passage, if you go on and read here in Matthew chapter 13, they're asking, how does this story you just told, how does it relate to us? What's the lesson? We didn't get it, Jesus. We like your story. It held our attention. It was a good story. But tell us, how does this relate to us? Well, Jesus then goes on to explain. He says, well, first of all, I'm the one who sows the good seed. I'm the sower of the good seed. And he said, the field is the world. And in the world, there are both good wheat and weeds. The good wheat are those who follow Jesus, who are Christians, and then the weeds are those who don't follow Jesus. Instead, according to Jesus, in verse 38, he says, they are children of the evil one. So Jesus does recognize the division between those who belong to him and those who belong to the evil one. He says, there is a difference here. There's no blurry lines. In fact, Jesus even says in verse 43, he says, the ones who belong to him will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. And in verses 40 and 42, he says, those who do not belong to him, well, there's consequences. Jesus says they will be burned with fire. They're evildoers. They'll be collected by the angels, and they'll be thrown into the furnace of fire, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth, says Jesus. Now, how many of you can see that Jesus does recognize the distinction? He's not what's called a universalist. So how does this apply to us? What can we learn from this story that Jesus just told and explained to his disciples? Well, the first thing we learn is that there are both good and bad in the world and in the church. There are both wheat and weeds. You might beware. You might be sitting close to somebody who's a weed. Did you know that even in the church, there might be a few people who are unsaved, people who don't live the way the Bible instructs? There could be weeds in our midst. Now, what did the workers want to do when they realized and discovered there were weeds in the field? What did they want to do? Do you remember? They wanted to start removing them, right? Throwing them out of the field, pulling them out, uprooting them. what does Jesus tell those of us who want to do that? He says it's not your job to do that. Second lesson we learn is it's not our calling or responsibility to decide who's in or out. It's not our call. We don't make that judgment. We're not even supposed to do that. You might say, well, Craig, I'm not blind. I can spot a sinner or a weed a mile away. Well, good for you. Jesus says, by their fruit you shall know them. So we all probably can discern, possibly, who's in or out. But here's the point. Ancient farmers could not be 100% sure who was a good weed and what was a bad weed. During the growing season, both of them looked kind of the same, according to Jesus. And he says it wasn't until the end that the determination was to be made as to who was a weed and who was a wheat. Many years ago, I watched a video of a teaching of the great philosopher Aristotle. I'm not a scholar of Aristotle's works or a philosopher, but I could understand it because it was a video, kind of a cartoon video. I can get that. And in this video, Aristotle was explaining what is a happy life. How do you know if you had a happy life? And he said, halfway through your life, you really can't conclude whether your life is happy or not because you're only halfway through your life. You've got the rest of your life. So if you have a miserable, unhappy life, the first part of your life, hang in there because you've got the rest of your life. He says you might get 3/4 of the way through your life, and it may or may not be happy, but you can't really conclude whether you had a happy life or not because your life's not over. He says you've got to wait until the end of your life. And after your life is lived in completion, then you can make the determination whether you have a happy life or not. You say, well, what does that have to do with Jesus' teaching? Well, we have to look at people that way. Sometimes people who call themselves Christians might look like weeds. They might look immature. Their life might be a little careless, spiritually careless. They might be disobedient. They may appear very uncommitted, theologically unsound. They might practice sinful behaviors, and they may look like weeds and appear to be hopeless. But you have to remember their lives are not over yet. How would you like to have been judged at your Christian life when maybe you were in your 20s? Maybe when you were just starting out. You see, their lives aren't over yet. They may change. They may become transformed. They may be spirit-filled. They may follow Jesus completely at the end of their life. I had a guy that I used to work with when I was many, many years ago when I was in college. I worked night shift. And there was this guy that I worked with named Ken. And Ken was a foul human being. He said he was a Christian, but I didn't believe him at all. He was filled with bitterness. He was hateful. He was rude. He was despicable. That was my opinion. And not only did I have that opinion, I shared that opinion with all his coworkers. Nobody liked the guy. He was nasty. He had a poor attitude. He made the women cry. He made the guys angry. He got beat up a couple of times, I remember, just because people just got sick of him. And I thought, if anybody's going to go burn in hell, it's going to be this guy. Because, boy, was he a weed. He was a thistle. Well, a couple of years ago, I was reading the newspaper on the internet from my hometown. And I saw this guy's obituary. And I thought to myself when I first saw it, oh, good. My hometown is a better place now. I really thought that. But then I read the obituary, and I couldn't believe what I was reading. And I had to look over to make sure that the name on top of this obituary was the same guy that I knew, because it might have been a guy with the same name, because it sure didn't describe the fellow that I knew. But his picture was next to it, and I recognized him. And as I read this obituary, I could not believe what I was reading. And it was talking about how people loved him at his church. And it talked about how much his grandchildren loved him. And what a sweet, kind, loving man he was. I'm sitting there thinking, oh my goodness. This weed, this thistle, got totally transformed from a bitter, nasty, awful human being to a person that was loved by his church and admired by his grandchildren. I thought his family would hate him and have written him off years ago. You see, we can't really make a judgment on people because we don't know until their life is over what God's going to do in their life. If we judge them, mistreat them, disrespect them, look down on them, or treat them unkindly, then we might be treating someone that God is working in their lives without love and without kindness. You know, we United Methodists have part of our theology is a doctrine called prevenient grace. How many of you have ever heard of that term? Okay, so you have. It's prevenient grace. You say, well, what is that? What is prevenient grace? Well, prevenient grace literally is the call of God. It's literally the stirring in your heart of the Spirit of God that awakens you to interest in spiritual things. You see, a lot of times people think that when they get up and decide to follow Jesus or go to church or change their lives or get their act together finally, that it's them making that decision or determination. It's not. It's God beginning to stir in your heart. And so prevenient grace is the call of God toward Christ of human beings. Therefore, if we believe in prevenient grace, that God is calling people, that God calls people to church, to salvation, to waking them up spiritually and stirring their heart, then I don't want to get in God's way, do you? By being judgmental, by being rude, and by not treating people in a loving way. I don't want to be a stumbling block. You know, I'm a pretty conservative evangelical label, if you want to label me. I don't worry about that. You know, sometimes in the Methodist Church, you want to be careful labeling yourself. But I gladly label myself as a pretty conservative, evangelical, United Methodist. But one thing I do not do is get in God's way. No matter who people are, no matter where they're at in their life, you know, if they walk into the church, if God, I figure if someone walks into this church building, they're here. God sent them here. You know what I'm saying? They just didn't one day just, well, where am I? Oh, I'm in church. No, if they're here, it's because God has sent them. And I'm going to be nice to them, treat them with respect. And if they need to change, which they probably do, then I'm going to let God do it, right? Not my job. If Jesus loved them enough to die for them, then the least I can do is to love a sinner and treat him with respect and love myself. If Jesus can die for him on the cross, right? Third, in the field, the wheat and the weeds coexist. Did you catch that in the story? They coexist side by side. Weeds in the church might bother people. They might say, well, you know, if we allow sinners in the church or weeds in our church, then we're tolerating and condoning sin. But in verse 30, what does Jesus say? He says, let both of them grow together until the harvest. Doesn't mean we approve of their sin. Doesn't mean we are tolerant of sin. Doesn't mean that we have compromised or watered down our theology or moral standards. But what it means is that we're going to treat people, whoever they might be, in a kind and loving manner, and let God deal with them instead of us. How many think that's a good idea? You know, over the years, I've learned very clearly, I mean, God showed me this many decades ago, that he does a better job at cleaning the fish than I do. God calls us to catch the fish, but when we catch them, what does he do? He cleans them. He didn't tell me I have to clean them. That's the Spirit of God's job. And think of this. Weeds could be your kids, your friends, family members, people you care about, your grandkids. How would you want them to be treated by a church if they're someplace else? I mean, if you got a family member, someone you love and care about, and they're not who they should be, and they're not following God, but they all of a sudden they get a stir in their heart and they start going to church, but they go to church with a bunch of judgmental, I don't know what you call them, Christians that aren't nice. Man, believe me, I've been there. I remember walking in church one time, people looking at me like, what are you doing here? You're not dressed right. uh, so you want them to you want them to be loved and treated nice if they're your loved ones. Personally, I find that most people respond better. I found over the years that most people will respond better if we treat them nice and respectful than if we try to wave our finger at them and straighten them out. So in conclusion, what better place for weeds to be in than the field, God's field, the church, right? You know, I notice here on especially our two earlier services, we have plenty of seats remaining for sinners, don't you think? Wouldn't it be great to have all these seats filled with sinners? Well, no, we want church people. Well, I like church people, but you know what? What a great place for sinners to come to. I mean, what would they do if they come to our church? They'd hear the word of God, right? How many think I'd do them some good? Hopefully they'd be loved by God's people and be welcome. And they would receive communion, and they'd hear good worship. I think that would be a means of grace, an open door for the power of God to touch their lives. Someday they may be transformed into beautiful followers of Jesus. Not all, but I bet a bunch of them would. How much did Jesus love sinners, do you know? He loved them with everything. He gave his life for them. Now tell me if that's not real love. One of the beautiful things about Methodism that I like about the United Methodist Church is the practice of grace in ministry. One thing I like about the Methodist Church, you have some good, solid theology without all the religious baggage that some folks have. And, you know, we want to welcome people, and we just want to just love them and love them into the kingdom. Doesn't mean that we compromise our values, doesn't mean we compromise our theology or biblical stand, but it does mean that we love them like Jesus did. I never remember, never forget, Jesus ate with sinners, didn't he? And so, you know, it's not our job to judge people, and we won't. But we will be faithful to Christ. So let's bow our heads for prayer. Lord, I thank you for